Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, everyone, depending on where you're joining from. Thanks for all the people who are joining us online. We also have some friends joining us here in ISHR office in Geneva. Thanks for taking time out. It's evening for a lot of you, and we are very happy that you're finding time to join us for this. We are here to present the 2022 Corporate Human Rights Benchmark, the key findings. My name is Namit Agarwal. I'm the Social Transformation Lead for WBA. And I'll be joined by my colleagues Sofía and Talya, who will be taking us through the presentation and key findings. The format for today, and if we can go to the agenda slide. We'll get into a presentation with some of our key findings. We'll also tell you a bit about WBA and CHRB. I'm assuming most of you know, but in case some of you don't know, we'll present the key findings and some of the serious allegations that we have found in this year's CHRB report, and then also tell you a bit about our resources and what kind of data is available and how we can use it and work with you on that. We will then take some questions from folks who are joining online, and then we'll get into a discussion for offline. So the first 30 minutes is in a hybrid format with both people joining us here and also online. And the last 30 minutes is for people who are here just having a conversation. So thanks again. Thanks for being here with us. And with that, I'll hand over to Sofía to take us through the presentation.
Hi, everyone. Thank you to everyone joining us virtually. Thank you for everyone joining us in the room. I never know where to look at when we're doing this, so apologies, I'm not looking at the right person right now. But just to start, so for those that maybe don't know so much about our work, the World Benchmarking Alliance, or WBA for short, it's a non-for-profit organization that develops free and publicly available benchmarks to compare companies on the SDGs and the Paris Agreement. What we do is create these benchmarks of free and public data that give all stakeholders, so investors, governments, civil society, individuals, and companies themselves, to actually have the information they need to engage and step up. And the way we do this is that, we couldn't do a benchmark per SDG. We would be 17 and we'd go crazy. And also we recognize that all of these topics are interconnected. So we have this model that you see on the right. We call it a little wheel of cheese. That's the 7 systems transformation. And it's basically the transformations that companies can contribute to actually make sure that happens and would be needed to achieve the SDGs by 2030. So if you see actually on the right, we have decarbonization, food and agriculture, nature, digital, urban, financial, and at the heart is the social transformation. That's the team that you see here with us, following the idea that the SDGs say no, leave no one behind. So every single benchmark in WBA has the social transformation at the heart. And at the basis of the social transformation is respect for human rights. So again, the wheel of cheese, if you actually zoom into this red dot, you see we are assessing normally 3 different elements. We're looking at respect for human rights at the basis, providing and promoting decent work, and ethical conduct. And if we zoom in again on human rights, WBA assesses human rights on 2 different ways. So one is that at scale, we embed fundamental human rights indicators on every one of the benchmarks we have. And that's kind of on 2,000 companies and our core social indicators. And then we also actually provide a deep dive into high-risk sectors through the Corporate Human Rights Benchmark, or CHRB, to get closer to performance and closer to sector-specific risks. And the report we're here to present is the 5th iteration of the Corporate Human Rights Benchmark on the 2022 CHRB. We're very happy to present this new version. We launched it last week. It's actually the first one that used our updated methodology we launched last year. This methodology is reflecting the kind of ambition of the UNGP 10+ roadmap of actually raising the ambition, also of getting closer to performance. Was in that sense more emphasis on beyond the policy and the commitments on how processes have performance and how companies are demonstrating their commitment they took to respect human rights. We looked at 127 companies in 3 sectors: the food and agriculture sector, ICT manufacturing, and automotive manufacturing. And 65% of these companies actually engage with us, which means we send them the draft assessment, and they actually engage with us through a call. They send us further feedback. So we are seeing kind of increasing engagement rate on the CHRB. And just to give you an idea, what are we looking at? These 127 companies on 3 sectors. I think it's a little bit too small for the people in the room, so I apologize, but everything is on the website. But basically, we're looking at the main steps, including also in the UNGPs in terms of governance and commitments, embedding human rights, basically by having resources, by having responsibilities, but also by having human rights due diligence. We're looking at grievance mechanisms. We're looking at performance, in particular, kind of human rights risks relevant for the sector. And finally, we're looking at responses to serious allegations. So I guess the question now is like, all of this is the background. What did we find? And now Talya is going to share us actually our key findings.
Yeah, so I'll dive into the key findings. First, my name is Talya. I'm an engagement manager for the social transformation. So let's start with the good news. Since the first iteration of the CHRB in 2017, we've seen clear company progress. So what we did is we selected a handful of key indicators that look at commitments, human rights due diligence, and grievance mechanisms. And we looked at trends over time. We found that over the years, the share of companies that score 0 on these key indicators have decreased. In other words, companies are taking more action on human rights. And we saw that this improvement occurred even when we updated the methodology and created requirements that were more strict. So this is the good news. So in terms of how the sectors improve, we saw that 66% of the food and agricultural product companies, 65 of the ICT manufacturing companies, and 57 of the automotive manufacturing companies have improved their scores since they were first benchmarked in the CHRB. On the right-hand side, you can see the percentage of companies taking initial steps on human rights due diligence per sector when they were first included in the benchmark, and then how many of them take the initial steps of due diligence this year. So again, you can see clear improvement there. Thanks, Sofía. Now I'm adding a bit more nuance to the good news. There's always a bit of more nuance to that. So given that the UNGPs were endorsed over 10 years ago, the pace at which companies are improving on these key aspects of respecting human rights, it's simply too slow. And embedding human rights still remains a major challenge within companies. So what are we saying? We're saying that score improvements show that there's a clear momentum for corporate respect for human rights, but we really think that regulatory action could provide a very needed push for companies to move more rapidly to respect the human rights of all affected stakeholders. I'll move on to the next key finding. Yeah, thanks, Sofía. So our second key finding is on human rights due diligence. So this year we saw that 46 of the companies benchmarked score 0 on our human rights due diligence indicators. In the 2020 assessment, which was our last assessment, it was 58 of these companies. So it's about a 10% improvement, which we consider as movement in the right direction, but just not fast enough. This year, we wanted to go beyond just naming the companies that scored 0. So we asked 2 questions. Where are companies improving on due diligence, and where are they stuck or need more guidance? And the second question is, what are those that are improving doing that those that are not improving not doing? In other words, what are the enablers for a better human rights due diligence process? So answering the first question, we see most progress in the initial steps on due diligence, namely identifying, assessing, and taking initial actions on negative risks and impacts. But very few companies are taking the final steps of evaluating how effective these actions are and communicating on this. We also see that more companies are meeting the basic requirements, but very few are achieving best practice, which includes things like engaging with affected stakeholders in all of the due diligence stages. Regarding the second questions, what are the enablers? We found a strong positive correlation between allocating board responsibility for human rights and resources for day-to-day human rights functions and due diligence scores. We also saw that 70% of the most improved companies on due diligence have established senior management level responsibility for human rights. So although at this point, this is a simple correlation, we can say with relative certainty that these are steps that could contribute for companies to improve their due diligence processes. And this data can be used by a variety of stakeholders, such as investors, for example. I'll move into the third key finding, which is on stakeholder engagement. So the updated CHRB methodology that was published in 2021 replaced the indicator on commitment to stakeholder engagement and instead decided to focus on implementation. So in 2020, we saw that about 66% of companies committed to engaging with affected stakeholders. This year, we again replaced this requirement. We embedded stakeholder engagement throughout our methodology, specifically in the human rights due diligence indicators and grievance mechanisms. And we wanted to see how this actually plays out. How does this commitment turn into practice? And when we took a look at how the sector's benchmark performed, we saw that stakeholder engagement is a major weakness across the three sectors that were benchmarked. So we saw that 71% of companies scored 0 on their approach to engaging with affected stakeholders on a regular basis. We also saw, when it came to human rights due diligence, that almost a quarter of companies described how they engage with affected stakeholders when they identify human rights risks and impacts. But then when it comes to the later stages of a due diligence process of assessing, taking action, and communicating on those risks, less than 5% of companies have included stakeholders in these subsequent steps of human rights due diligence. And then similarly, 91% of companies did not disclose whether they engage with potential or actual users of their grievance mechanisms when designing, implementing, and improving them. In terms of kind of where we see this key finding being used, I think it's of great policy relevant at the moment. We see ongoing debates on how to incorporate meaningful stakeholder engagement in various national regulations and CHBR. So yeah, this is an incredibly important finding this year. I'll hand it back to Sofía now to walk us through the other key findings.
Thank you, Talya. Okay, finding 4 is on supply chains. So CHRB looks at how particular human rights risks that are very relevant and salient for the sectors we're looking at are assessed by companies, including how they include these issues in the way they work with their suppliers. Issues such as health and safety, living wages, working hours, child and forced labor, land rights, access to water, and women's rights. And what we found is basically, we're saying here is that companies are taking a hands-off approach on human rights in their supply chains. Why do we say this? And if you see actually the graphic in the right, we have that a third, and only a third, of the companies we assist on average have provisions in the contracts with their suppliers on these human rights risks. 11% of them are actually working with their suppliers to address these human rights risks and issues. And only 2% on average are actually monitoring progress and tracking how many people are affected by these issues in their supply chains. To give you, for example, like an example to make it a bit more clear, if we look, for example, at the ICT companies, we find that it's, I think, 93% of them have a clause or mention recruitment fees on their contracts, but only 33% of them work with their suppliers on it, and only 9% of them is actually seeing how many are actually affected by the issue and progressing, tracking progress. We see also that this it's different between different issues and different sectors. So maybe you would expect like issues such as health and safety and forced labor tend to appear more in contracts of suppliers, while issues like land rights or living wages are actually much less common. We also find that in terms of, as you see here, again, maybe a bit small, but on the right, the ICT sector, around half of them has requirements and the contracts and expectations from the suppliers through their contracts, while the automotive sector is only 16%. And actually 0% of the automotive companies assessed is assessing kind of how many people are affected in their supply chains in the issues that are relevant to them. So not great images. This is particularly important because when Talya actually talks to us about the serious allegations section, we see that most of the allegations actually take place in the supply chain. And hence, when companies are not really working through this, they're actually kind of keeping a blind eye on where most of their actually human rights impacts are actually taking place. last key finding, we in WBA are always very keen, since we have data on climate and we have data on social, of actually bringing to the conversation how are these things interrelated or not in the way that companies actually work on this. In the 2020 CHRB, we ran a correlation between the automotive companies we assessed on CHRB and these same companies that were assessed on WBA's climate benchmark. What we found then is that there is no correlation. So, companies that could be very good on climate may be disclosing very little on human rights, and vice versa. Companies that may be actually disclosing a lot on human rights may be disclosing very little on their low carbon transition plans, emissions, etc. This year, the same correlation again, no surprises there, still no correlation. But now we have another layer of data, that is that we have a just transition assessment that looks at the same companies and how they're actually preparing on their local carbon transition plans to ensure they leave no one behind by reskilling companies, by having just transition plans, by having social dialogue. And what we found is that companies that actually have a good human rights approach, that's very highly correlated with having a good just transition approach. This may sound kind of obvious because basically we're saying that if you have an approach, a rights-based approach, the way you treat your people, that means that when you're approaching your climate plans, you're implementing that human rights lens in your climate plans. We found something very similar in a study we did last year on the impact of COVID-19 and how companies were prepared or not to protect their workers and the supply chains on COVID, that the companies that already had the measures in terms of human rights diligence and the process actually did much better in a COVID study in terms of actually reacting and protecting their workers during COVID and vice versa. So with that reflection, I want to hand it back to Talya just to walk us through serious allegations, and that's
great. So we just presented kind of the methodology in the beginning, but 20% of a company's overall score will be calculated depending on how they responded to serious allegations that are made against them. So in the 2022 benchmark, we considered 174 serious allegations of negative human rights impacts. Out of the 127 companies benchmarked, more than half had at least one serious allegation connected to them. As a reminder, we are not assessing the allegation itself, but rather how companies responded to the allegation. Overall, we found that there is a clear gap between companies publicly acknowledging the serious allegations and actually responding to them by providing remedy and engaging with the affected stakeholders. Out of the 174 allegations reviewed, only in 5% of the cases did the companies show that they provided remedy that was satisfactory to the victims. As shown in the figure on the slide, the most common types of allegations related to forced labor, discrimination, and health and safety. Less than half of the allegations, about 45%, concern the company's own operations, and the most common types of allegations in the company's own operations were related to health and safety, often linked to COVID-19 safety measures, discrimination, and freedom of association and collective bargaining. Then the remaining allegations were in the supply chain, so 55% of them. The most common types of allegations in the supply chain are forced labor, child labor, and discrimination. I think another interesting finding was that while the majority of allegations were against companies headquartered in OECD member countries, the opposite is true when it comes to the location of the negative human rights impact. So we saw that 82% of the impacts occurred in non-OECD countries. And on the next slide, thank you, Sofía, you can see a map that shows the percentage of allegations occurring in each region in the world and the most common types of allegation per region. I think that can provide insights on kind of the key human rights risks and negative impacts that are associated with specific regions in the 3 sectors that we benchmarked. I think we can.
Great. So thanks for sharing this. We're going to take some questions online first. We already have a couple of questions coming in.
And can I just say before, because I wanted to say it at the beginning, this is just part of the team. We have also some colleagues that are probably watching this virtually, and we just wanted to give them a shout out for their great work. So particularly Hannah, Viviana, and Rachel that maybe are watching.
And Annabelle, thank you very
Annabelle,
much.
Yes.
And I also want to thank the IRIS Foundation that conducted the research for WB and the Corporate Human Rights Benchmark. So thank you, Peter, Jana, Ellie, felicitas. Thank you.
So we have a few questions. You want to talk about the resources?
Yeah. Yeah, but that's right before the question. So as we do every year, what do we publish? What do we put out there? So first, we're putting the ranking of companies benchmarked. Then we also publish an insights report, which includes the key finding as well as sector analysis. We also publish individual company scorecards that you're able to download. And then we publish a detailed data sheet, which includes all of the underlying data used in our assessment. So all of this is on our website, available to be used and hopefully to advocate for corporate human rights responsibility. Thank you.
Thanks so much. So one of the questions we have from Coco Zubairi from the Gates Foundation, what tools were used to get the companies to report their data? And were there any incentives for companies to respond?
Want
to take that?
What tools are used for companies
to collect this information to get them to share the data with us? So
the CHRB is based on publicly available information. What we do is we assess companies on their disclosures. And then for the serious allegations part, we would look at any reports or news articles that come out. What we do is we always share the assessment with companies and provide them an opportunity to engage with us, provide feedback directly to information that we might have missed in the research or any new disclosures that were not out there when we first conducted the research. So yeah, to answer the question in short, publicly available information, but we always give companies an opportunity to respond and engage with us throughout the process.
And do you give any incentives to the companies to give the data?
Incentives to the companies to get the data?
FOMO, no.
Yeah. I'm not really sure how to answer that. But
well, that's being in the public domain.
Yeah, exactly. It's about exactly because we put the ranking in the public domain, and we're basically we're showing what companies are already demonstrating this or not demonstrating this through their publicly available information. What we're doing is just collating it and comparing them against each other. So there's a mix of a race to the top of actually wanting to be able to demonstrate what they're doing or actually not appear like they're not doing anything. This information actually goes to investors, goes to civil society, goes to policymakers, so goes to their stakeholders that may also use this data. And one of the reasons, I think, as Talya said, like everything's on our website, is that we want organizations to actually be able to use this to drive that change and to actually hold companies accountable. And we want companies to use this information to actually use it as a roadmap and be like, okay, where are gaps? How can we improve for next time? So the idea is because it's publicly available information, it's a big drive.
Misunderstood
year after
that part
year,
of the question.
Year after year, because we get more and more companies engaged with us. This year in particular, we work with the Investor Alliance for Human Rights, and through the alliance, they can reach out to companies that had never engaged with us in previous years, saying like, hey, we know the CHRB is benchmarking you this year. Can you actually reach out to them and actually give them feedback? So we got companies for the first time sitting on a call with our research team, wanting to know how to improve. So that shows that actually investor leverage is actually getting companies on the table, at the table.
Another question, how do you measure satisfactory remedies?
So when it comes to the serious allegations, we would first look at whether the company responded publicly to the allegation. Then we want to see that they took steps to change their own systems, processes, and commitments. And then we want to see that they engage with stakeholders. So I think this is key of how we measure that. We want to see that the company is disclosing how they engage with stakeholders and determining what remedy is satisfactory. So that's the key issue. And all of the indicators on how we assess that are available on our website, but I think stakeholder engagement is definitely key in how we do that. And we want to see that the company is disclosing that publicly and explaining how they went about it.
Thank you. There are lots of questions, but maybe I'll just take two more. How do companies respond when you show them the data, and how are they committing to improve? You want to talk about the engagement rate?
Yeah, so this year we had a 65% engagement rate, which is the highest we've ever had in the CHRB. I think 90% of the engagement is very positive. I think companies are kind of, since I joined WBA, I definitely see that the human rights teams are growing. Companies are taking this more seriously, maybe the regulatory momentum is helping. Maybe they're just more used to the requirements. And I think that generally speaking, they ask questions about how they can meet the requirements. What do we mean? They would ask us what type of information they should disclose, what is missing from their disclosure. So a lot of the time it's just about explaining requirements, going back to the basics and to the UNGPs, and hopefully seeing improvement over time, which we have on some aspects. Yeah.
Thank you. Just two final questions. One from Nicole. Would WBA change an analysis of a company if that company shared non-public information, or must the information triggering an improvement be public facing?
So yes, we only assess publicly available information. There is one exception when we look at serious allegations if the information might harm victims or affected stakeholders. This is the only time that we accept non-public information. But the benchmark is based on, we want to increase transparency by looking at publicly available information.
Perfect. And I'll take this final question. This is from Sarah. How are you measuring progress on human rights due diligence when a company has conducted a double materiality process? Tough one.
So the way we assess human rights due diligence, we're not prescriptive in a sense of how the company should conduct that process. What we want to see is that all the steps are there. So part of it can come, not all of it. Part of it can be informed by audits, for example. Part of it could probably be informed by the double materiality assessment. But what we want to see is that the company is identifying, assessing, taking action and tracking and communicating on human rights risks. And that can be done through many different means. We're not prescriptive again. And obviously involve stakeholders throughout the process. Yeah. Perfect.
Thanks so much. And thanks everyone for these questions. I know there are a few questions that we have not answered, but we can get back to you sometime.
We put the email there. If you want to reach out to us,
yes.
Have any questions, if you want to use the data, if you want to engage with us, we're very happy to have that conversation. So please email us.
Thanks.
The room as well.
Thanks everyone who's joined us online. It's a pleasure having you all, and do reach out to us on this email ID if you have further questions, and we'll be in touch. Thanks everyone.